In the old towns and villages of Britain, before the police, before the tabloids, before social media shamestorms, there were other ways to deal with those who stepped outside the rules. Noisy ways, cruel ways, dangerous ways, rough music. Picture it. The midnight banging of pots and pans, the screech of fiddles and whistles, the jeers of a crowd dragging somebody backwards on a donkey, their sins made public in a carnival of chaos. These rituals, part punishment, part theatre, part folk magic, lived at the dark edge where community, cruelty and celebration collided. Welcome, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen and my guest this time is Liz Williams, a Glastonbury-based author, columnist and owner of the esoteric bookshop Cat and Cauldron. Liz's wide-ranging work moves between speculative fiction, pagan spirituality and deep dives into the folklore of Britain. And in her latest book, Rough Music, Liz explores these transgressive, forgotten traditions of noise, mockery and ritual humiliation, and how they ripple forward into today's culture. We also talk about the fool, the trickster, that disruptive figure who mocked authority, turned the world upside down and reminded us that order is never complete without disorder. I was speaking to Liz from a place where I live part of the time, Findhorn in northern Scotland, which has got an esoteric spiritual centre of its own, but nothing to compare with Glastonbury, famous because of its festival, but in fact 100 plus years tradition of New Age spirituality and esoteric practices have been going on there. So join us as we bang the pans, summon the ghosts of village greens and step into that unsettling territory where folklore, fear and freedom meet. Hi Liz, good to see you. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you very much indeed.
Liz, you are in Glastonbury, which I could describe, I suppose, as the sort of sacred omphalos of ancient Albion. What's it like to actually live there?
I think the word you're looking for is probably sometimes bonkers. Sometimes quite a profound place, actually. It's a very liminal place. That there are lots and lots of different religions, spiritual paths, probably more than I would think, about 40 of different kinds and flavours. There's a lot of New Age here, there's a lot of Buddhism, there's a lot of Christianity, there's a lot of paganism, Wicca, heathenism, and the occult, all of that sort of thing. It's unusual in that everybody pretty much does rub along and get along. It's one of those places that does work, being sort of multicultural on a whole different variety of levels, not racially particularly, I have to say, or ethnically, but certainly in terms of religions. You know, we're unusual in that, and I think we're probably unusual in the amount of cooperation that goes on between groups.
That description, funnily enough, could be said exactly of where I am at the moment, which is in Findhorn in northern Scotland.
Glastonbury is older, but the sort of countercultural element of Glastonbury isn't that old. Probably about 120 years, absolute tops. Prior to that, it was a Christian market town for, most of its history.
Maybe it's more recently that it's become the sort of omphalos of alternative Britain, but it had these roots going back, didn't it, with the association with the Arthurian legends, with Joseph of Arimathea. Liz, you've got a career as a science fiction writer, fantasy writer as well, but in terms of your non-fiction, you've been writing about pagan Britain. You're also a practitioner. You've written Miracles of Armokian History of Paganism, you've written the Compendium of the Occult. In terms of rough music, your most recent book, Folk Customs, Transgressions and Alternative Britain, it's quite a romp through festivities, ceremonies, rituals, traditions going back in these islands through time, which I'm sure to people here often sound odd, and to people abroad, maybe not familiar with British, must sound absolutely crackers, a lot of them. Just to give you an example, tell us what the Dorset Ouza is.
The Dorset Ouza is a mask. It's a very creepy, odd-looking mask with huge, big, goggly eyes and horns. It's something that was found originally, I think, in a house in a barn. They don't know what its origins were. I have a private theory that somebody actually brought it back from the Far East. It fits over your head, so you can actually wear it. And at the moment, it is used for Morris dancing, but it is very scary. It's sort of demonic, kind of a devil. I think it is very weird, and I think, people from abroad will find it peculiar, but then there are an awful lot of these sorts of masks in Indonesia, in India, and, if you go into a Chinese temple, You find a lot of sort of kind of similar images and effigies, actually. So in a way, that's sort of one of the least surprising ones.
Right. In these folk customs, what would you say is one of the most surprising ones?
The most surprising one is actually the annual Shin Kicking contest, which takes place in Gloucestershire between men, but I'm sure there is a female version, in which you basically have to kick somebody in the shins until they capitulate. Yeah, they walk among us.
Well, in this case, they limp amongst you, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, somebody's been really quite badly hurt by it, actually. You end up very bruised and sore, although you're not supposed to wear, like, hobnail boots. I'm sure back in the day they probably did do this in hobnail boots, but you're not supposed to wear your industrial steel cap Doc Martens for it, But it's still very, very painful to be kicked in the shins, actually. So that's an odd one. And this is a sort of, I think, a lunatic kind of macho bravado that prevails among some of these customs. Because street football, where people, in a town form different sides and vie for the capture of a leather object filled with straw, that's an odd one as well. But it's, again, you could expand this right up to Premier League. And so football's pretty strange. And what about rugby, when you're actually tackling men to the ground? So
Not to mention what used to happen anyway on the terraces.
yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, some of these things I think are, and this is where perhaps we're starting to get into the transgression question, are forms of licensed violence.
Yeah. I wanted to read you something. Little did those druids know that those aeons back in time, that when they lit their holy fire, the conflagration would inspire the brockers of today to mime and carry on the glow. Little do those frame folk know who live outside Murray, the welcome that the clavey meets from all who follow through the streets. And don't forget those witches hurry from that uncanny glow. So I'd like you all to know, in Murray and elsewhere, we'll keep the clavey burning bright, send witches flying old year's night. As long as we have tar to spare, we'll make the dory glow. Do you know what that is?
No, I don't. It's fantastic, though.
That's Margaret Smith from 1957. The reason I read that is that the next village on from here is called Birkhead. And on January the 11th every year, they have something called the clavey, which is a barrel full of tar and burning staves. And they carry it around the town, mainly men as far as I remember, followed by a large crowd. They take it up on the Doory Hill, which is the ramparts of an ancient Bronze Age fort, where it's wedged, and then after refueling, it's allowed to burn out and fall down the hill, and all the smouldering embers go and are gathered up by people who can, in possession of a piece of the clavey, is said to bring good luck for the coming year. And in fact, some pieces are sent around the world. The reason I mention it is that it's been going on for almost 300 years.
Wow. Right.
And it involves a certain amount of risk.
Yes.
A bit like the shin kicking, the cheese rolling, which is another custom that you talk about.
Huge. Yes.
The clavey nearly run into problems a couple of years back when the local council were threatening to stop it unless they got public liability insurance.
Right. Yes.
Which, of course, no insurer in their right mind is going to insure an event like that.
Yes.
So there is this thing, Liz, is there not, about risk, about the darkness, violence, which underpins a lot of these customs. And you use the word transgression. And I wondered whether we could start with you talking about what that means to you or how you see that transgressive element in these folk customs.
I think what I'm taking it to mean is that it's a licensed deviation from the norms of a particular culture, and sometimes an unlicensed deviation. So in the forms, in what's referred to as skimity riding, which is a kind of a custom of public shaming, nobody actually sort of sanctions that. That's when, for example, you're in a little village, a local couple are caught having an affair with each other. You create effigies of them, you tie those effigies onto a donkey, and you parade the effigies through the town shouting, "Shame, shame, aren't they awful people?" And, this still happens, but it's gone online. So now we're cancelling people and calling them out. You've got call-out culture right across the political spectrum in various forms, but prior to that, it would have been something that you did in the actual village. That's a little bit different because it's public shaming and directed at a particular target. Now, people do still try to curtail all of these things, not so much because of any perceived immorality, but now that's sort of shifted into the purview of health and safety. So you've got the cheese rolling, which, as you said, is transgressed because it now goes against our norms of health and safety. You've got things like the Clavey, but like Lewis as well was the first thing that come to mind, where they roll tar barrels through the streets. They do it at Dunster as well. It's part of the bonfire night celebrations. And that, God knows how Lewis get away with this, because nobody's ever hurt or never badly hurt, but it is extremely dangerous. Bonfire night celebrations, they're supposed to commemorate the failure of the plot. They're not celebrating the fact that it happened.
Right, so for anybody who doesn't know, outside these islands, it's a very famous November the 5th, used to be anyway, a thing which commemorates Guy Fawkes' attempt to blow up Parliament, a kind of revolutionary act which is foiled. And then certainly when I was a kid, there would be a bonfire in the streets or in some waste ground every year on November the 5th, and an effigy of Guy Fawkes would be flung onto the fire. Kids, of course, loved it. They would actually gather clothes and during the previous month to make the guy, as it's called. Looking back on it, it was great fun, but you think like, hold on a minute, why were we burning this figure of this revolutionary who's trying to bring down the monarchy? A lot of us are Republicans by nature are thinking like, we're burning the wrong person here.
Yeah, absolutely. In Lewis, very much to commemorate the Catholic martyrs, there's a segment of the parade which does actually, because a lot of the bonfire conspirators came from Lewis. So that's a little bit different, because that's actually saying, no, we're remembering the people who were on the side of the plot, not the authorities' success in quelling it, which I think it has been in other areas. But it's sort of become a general thing. But that, again, fireworks is now very much prone to health and safety. Not just when I was a kid, it was, you could put someone's eye out with that kind of thing. Then it became more the big licensed displays. They're now coming under fire because people say that their animals are so distressed, which is, a big issue for a lot of people, actually. And it's not nice to think of, animals, dogs, cats upset because there are loud bangs outside. So I would predict that within my lifetime, that form of transgression is going to go away, and you're going to have silent fireworks, because you can have one, won't have a bang. And I don't care, actually, because I really like the light show. I'm not worried about these massive, thunderous, warlike explosions, which are a bit much sometimes. And it used to be bonfire night, but now it's like the 2 weeks on either side. It just seems to extend into the weekends and so on.
Let's talk more about that, because so transgression for you, some of these rituals, in fact, the title rough music refers to this kind of cacophony, this racket that was set up to sort of publicly shame, say, somebody from the villages, you said, and maybe commit some infidelity, and the parade through the streets, drawing attention to them. So the transgression there is by the people who are the kind of subject of this social justice. And it's very interesting, isn't it, the way that the notion of social justice has changed in the last 300 years. So whereas we might see it now as kind of righting some wrong, of some huge corporation or some dodgy individual, then it was basically persecuting somebody who transgressed the Christian moral codes, right?
Yeah, it was absolutely persecuting people. It's actually a horrible thing to do. And in one of Hardy's novels, I can never remember which one, somebody actually either drops dead from a heart attack or kills themselves because of this public shaming, and it's a monumentally unpleasant thing to do.
Here is a sidebar with 5 violent, cruel, dangerous folk customs, rough music from British history. Number 1, riding the skimmington. As we discussed, this involved parading somebody, often an adulterer, drunkard or henpecked husband, through town on a donkey or ladder, facing backwards while the crowd banged pots, pans and shouted insults. Sometimes both guilty parties, like a couple in a domestic dispute, were forced to ride together, mocked by the neighbours, could turn violent, and was meant to shame people into behaving morally. Number 2, the skulls bridled the brank, a hideous metal cage-like mass clamped onto the head of nagging or gossipy women with a spiked bit pressed down on the tongue if they tried to speak. Victims paraded through town for humiliation, often jeered and abused by the crowd. Now obviously seen as a notorious symbol of misogynistic punishment. Another one is number 3, the cooking stool and ducking. Women accused of being scold prostitutes, petty criminals strapped into a chair, the cooking stool, and dunked repeatedly in a river or pond, while crowds gathered to laugh and jeer. Sometimes the accused drowned if left too long underwater. Number 4, the stocks and the pillories, a brutal punishment for offenders who were locked by hands, feet or head in wooden frames in the middle of town, while crowds pelted them with rotten food, mud, dead animals or stones which could maim, blind or kill. used for everything from petty theft to political dissent. Number 5, charivari, skimmington rides. A noisy mob would gather outside the house of an unpopular person, for example, a cuckolded man, a wife-beater or unfaithful spouse, and stage a mock trial with effigies, rough music and public ridicule. Sometimes the effigies were burned, sometimes real people were dragged out and forced to take part. Though intended as community justice, these could often escalate into violence and even death.
But a lot of the transgression in history has morphed and changed. A classic example is blacking up. Previously, we're going to black up our faces, we're going to put soot on our faces, we're going to go out and do Morris dancing or collecting money usually. Throughout all these collecting money type customs like wassailing, some of it is collecting money with slight menaces. We won't go until we've got some. Even carol singing has a bit of it. Or trick and treat is the other one. We're transgressing by tricking you. And we black up because we don't want our faces to be recognised. But I think most people know exactly who's coming to their door if it's a small community. But nobody would have said that it was wrong to actually put soot on your face. Now they do. Because of the concept of racism and anti-racism, you've got another form of transgression. So that has sort of morphed, from a transgression of not wanting anybody to know what you were actually doing at night on a particular festival, to the actual act of it is wrong because it's perceived as mocking an ethnic minority.
Is that right, though? Are we, particularly in these times, are we oversensitive in some way? There is an argument, isn't there, about ancient traditions, but just because something is ancient doesn't mean it's right or that we should carry on with it. Absolutely not right. But is it sometimes that we maybe reinterpret things in a modern light and we get oversensitive about things which might seem odd now or whatever, but in fact, had some fairly innocent, or as you say, some other explanation?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of explanations. I mean, some people say that it always did have a strain of racist behaviour because, Morris dancing is supposed, in some accounts, to come from the word Moorish. So you're sort of, you're emulating North African practices. I don't know if that's the case. I mean, this is such a loaded topic. I suspect it's just underdetermined that people did it for slightly different reasons throughout history. It's become even more loaded now because we do perceive it as bolted on to the racism issue. And I think there are quite a few, black activists and indeed black residents of Lewes who do object to it. Lewes got into trouble for dressing up as a Zulu war band. It's like a Victorian interpretation of the Zulu war band's costumes. And a friend of mine got an actual Zulu dance troupe involved in Lewes one year. And they did sit down and say, actually, we do find this a bit offensive. But because it's now perceived as having all this freight and weight and baggage and being directed at an ethnic minority, whether it originally was or not, I think a lot of Morris sides have just said, look, it's not actually that big a deal. We'll just put green on our faces instead, or we'll blue up. That's kind of ended the problem, really, unless we get Martians turning up who say, sort of slightly fence-sitting here, I'm aware.
I feel the same way about it. I'm not out to necessarily to offend anybody, but at the same time, I do feel that we also, all of us, take offence a bit too easily these days, and sometimes even maybe are quite keen to be offended in some way, so we can plead victim. But there is, of course, the opposite thing as well, which is vice signalling, which is something I've heard about recently, which is deliberately doing things to wind people up. But the transgressive thing is, for me, is particularly interesting in this because this show is largely about counterculture. We talk about counterculture of the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s. But of course, countercultural spirit, the countercultural themes extend through time. This is a particular kind of counterculture in a way, in terms of alternative Britain and these traditions which have, lasted to the present. But there's also an aspect of it as well, which is deeply countercultural, I think, which is where the traditions themselves were outlets, if you like, or opportunities for the establishment to be mocked or challenged.
Yes.
You could even call it a sort of safety valve. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that dates back to Roman times and the time of misrule in the winter when, the world is turned upside down. Masters dress as servants and have to serve their former servants. The servants themselves can do terrible things. They're not fully licensed to do stuff, but they are licensed to kind of overturn the social order. There is an element of that with a lot of these customs, and they're called folk customs for a reason, because although things like Morris dancing did start at the royal court, it very rapidly devolved down the social ranks. And although I am sure that there are upper middle class people who get involved in these things, a lot of it is still working class or rural culture. That's where it actually comes from. And the authorities don't always like it. The bonfire societies have attracted, across several hundred years, an awful lot of condemnation and attempted repression by the authorities, later on by the police. Although you're allowed to do it, they don't like you doing it because it's dangerous, because it's subversive, and because it can get out of hand. But I understand the police turn a blind eye to some of the grudge settling that allegedly goes on in street football matches. People do actually take the opportunity quietly to duff somebody up whom they've had a bad relationship with across the year. When it's supposed to be over, you've settled your score in this semi-licensed manner, and you haven't been arrested for assault, which you normally would be, whether that's apocryphal. But I'm sure it wasn't apocryphal, knowing how people behaved. I think there's a case regarding football violence as a sort of sanctioned at one point letting off of steam, which then got out of hand and had to be put down.
This is one of my theories, is the way that football violence, which I think was endemic in the 70s, maybe 80s, the way it was actually ended was by the introduction of ecstasy. And ecstasy is a great drug in some respects. I'm not recommending anybody takes it, by the way, but lots of kids started to take ecstasy, and including lots of football fans, and that sorted out the violence problem. Obviously, in the installation of seats and barriers, I'm not putting it all down to ecstasy.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case, because there is certainly, I think, the case that a lot of people who get involved in violent activities are involved in more than one violent activity. The Orange Marches, people are on some of those marches were known to the police as football hooligans as well. There's always going to be a certain section of society who just wants to fight. I don't think it's much more complicated than that. I don't think you need to attach huge socioeconomic titles or explanations to it, because football hooligans have turned out to be estate agents and junior accountants and so on. There's always going to be a certain type of bloke and sometimes a certain type of girl who just wants a ruck.
Absolutely right. And let's come back to that too, because I think there is something about riot and protest, which all gets mixed up together. Just to go back again to this idea of misrule and the safety valve of, like, society's safety valve of ritualizing in some way these things, because in medieval times you had the fools, didn't you? And again, the sort of figure who was allowed to speak truth to power.
Yes.
Whether it be in a rhyming couplet or in a sort of jest, the jester, who had this role at court, didn't they, actually, where, they could sort of mock the king or the queen in some way, or sort of make sly comments about, things that were going on at court, which everybody else would have got in deep trouble for, but they were sort of allowed to. And again, it was a sort of safety valve, right?
Yes, the Druids as well. The Druid was supposed to be a satirist who, if he'd really did his job properly, and it was a him, would be able to raise blisters on the target of his satire, actually be able to physically affect them. And that's very much the same sort of thing, I think. And then we had Spitting Image for many years.
We did. Yeah, the satirist programs par excellence, really, taking the piss out of absolutely everybody, right? And in fact, some of the people, they claimed to anyway, some of the politicians that were targeted claimed to actually enjoy it. Now, that reminds me, Liz, of something we mentioned just before we started here, which is the trickster. The trickster is an archetypal figure, an archetypal force throughout cultures, nothing to do with British culture particularly. It appears in mythology, Raven and Coyote in North America, Loki. There's all sorts of, trickster figures in all sorts of cultures. These figures, they're not good, they're not bad. They're disruptors, and they're necessary to disrupt the social order every now and again, in some ways to keep it like a living tradition. And it seemed to me that some of these customs, certainly some of the figures, that appear in your book, some of them are spooky, some of them are creepy, some of them are otherworldly and supernatural, but some of them just do seem to be this kind of trickster figure that's a kind of necessary boundary breaker.
Yeah, you get the Doctor in mystery plays, for example, or the Fool in mystery plays. That's very much that role. And they're also there, I think, to get the audience on side, because they will bring in local characters. They'll make sly references, which are in jokes to their audiences, and they'll poke fun at authority. Whatever the context, even in the context of a little biblical play, that's going to go on, and we know that went on. That transgression is sort of, taking us out of the ordinary world. It's like this is a show, a performance, but something that we ourselves can participate in. Cross-dressing is another example. Molly dressing, that's not necessarily evidence of people being transgender. They may well have been, they may not, but men in women's clothing in this culture, all the way up to the pantomime dame. When I was a kid, you'd turn on the TV and you'd be lucky to see a bloke who wasn't dressed in a woman's clothing, from Dick Emery, Danny LaRue, some of the Pythons. It's transgressive because it's seen as dangerous.
That's it. So there's some necessary danger in it through what we've been talking about so far with some of these rituals which are violent and some of them which are, are risky. This is a question for you because I've been wondering about it a lot when it comes to counterculture. There is this statement that's often used in the context of financial investments, which is without risk, there's no reward.
Right.
So in other words, you have to take some risk, you're talking about money investments, to reap some reward. Now, it seems to me that we live in a culture which is attempting, I think, impossibly and foolishly to eliminate risk.
Yes, I agree.
So we've got the health and safety movements, which I think we all kind of drive most of us bonkers at times, although, of course, it's well-meaning. Safeguarding is this thing which is applied to all walks of life these days. Again, well-meaning and not suggesting that people shouldn't be safe or have their risk minimized.
You can take it too far.
Yeah, and these are forces, they seem to me to be forces which are sometimes unconsciously dressed up as for our good.
Yes.
And yet in some odd way, some more indefinable way, they're actually not for our good, or they're limiting our good because they're actually countercultural.
Yeah, a lot of it's for control. And, my father used to complain about little Hitlers in his workplace, and there is definitely an element of that within the health and safety culture. And I think it's actually, health and safety is obviously necessary. I think if you're working in a factory and your head could be taken off by some rogue piece of equipment, health and safety is absolutely essential. Safeguarding is really essential in schools and colleges, but there is always going to be an element of people and of policy that comes in with more of the aim of control than the aim of benefit. And I think that's what people object to when they say health and safety gone mad. Sometimes they're just referring to the fact that they can't do what they want, which is completely unrealistic and actually often dangerous and stupid. But sometimes they are responding to what I feel there is a visceral understanding that this is not about their benefit, it's about controlling them.
Or it's about minimizing liability and litigation. So it's really not about actually protecting people from harm, but it's actually more protecting the people that are imposing it from being sued.
Well, I think most people who work in a company with a HR department will have realized very quickly that HR is there to protect the company, not the employee, whatever they say. Well, I think there's an element of truth in that.
The reason, to talk about such things as, say, health and safety and HR in this context is that if these customs were bleached of their risk, bleached of their potential violence, how sort of valuable are they? If the clevy, has to be sort of sanctioned behind railings and has to get public liability insurance, yeah, sure, it probably might mean that every now and again somebody's not going to get injured. But what do we lose? This is what I've been wondering in reading your book. This very rich and often dark and sometimes creepy stuff. But life can be dark, creepy, and risky. And if the traditions do not recognize that and in some way express it, or you could even say act as a safety valve, as I said before, we're not actually educating or cultivating our own sense of what living's like, are we?
No, and I think also a lot of these activities, they are dangerous. Lewis is dangerous. People very rarely get hurt at Lewis. I'm sure people do stupid things and perhaps get away with them. But I also think a lot of people, they either avoid it entirely, or if they go, they're careful about where they step. Different bonfire societies go off to different hills and they each have their own separate displays. So there's a lot of them. And then on the one I went to, somebody actually dropped a match in the firework box by mistake. So the whole lot went off at once. and it was like the Somme,
Sorry,
and throwing themselves flat on the floor. It was
Mm.
terrifying for about 3 minutes, and in retrospect, hilarious. But nobody got hurt.
And also, you remember it, right?
Yeah, and you certainly remember it, and you also remember not to drop the match in a bottle. So, but I do think people are often careful. We're careful when we drive. What's the most dangerous thing we can do? It's driving, probably, as we go parachuting or something. But in dangerous situations, most people do actually have enough common sense to not get into serious trouble. And I think the people who are in the bonfire societies themselves particularly probably have a very good innate understanding, much better than mine, of what damage this stuff can do. You know, health and safety is all very well if it's top down, but there is also an apprehension of health and safety that comes from the bottom up, from knowing what you're working with and actually knowing what you're doing.
And how about this? How about we accept that there will be risk and people, property may get damaged. And that is the price worth paying for the value which we get from, say, a 250-year-old festivity like the Clarbing or the Lewis bonfires. Do you know what I mean? It's obviously, it's okay you saying that if it's not you that's getting harmed. I accept that. But if we bleach all our traditions and customs of anything slightly risky or slightly dark or even slightly which challenges our current notions of what social mores should be like, then we are at risk, aren't we, of losing something?
Yeah, I mean, I think the popularity of these things and the popularity goes like this, goes in waves. So, you know, there will be sort of periods where people don't do this stuff so much and the audience is not great because they're all at home watching TV. But then, you know, the next generation, they get tired of that sort of very passive existence. Like wassailing is having a big comeback in Somerset at the moment. Wassailing is not a particularly hazardous activity, but it does involve guns. You know, people fire a shotgun through an apple tree. Kids love that sort of thing because they recognise instinctively, I think, that there is a slightly dodgy, transgressive element to it, even though it's just celebrating the apple harvest. And, you know, my favourite quote in the whole book is of the bloke who, when it looked like health and safety was going to put paid to the cheese rolling, said to The Guardian, "How am I going to hurt myself now?" A completely loony comment. It's very British, actually. And it's that, you know, you want to do it partly because it is letting off steam, partly because it's innately eccentric. And I think the British like that. That is the transgressive element of a lot of this stuff.
We want to put ourselves sometimes in slightly risky situations.
We wouldn't have extreme sports if people didn't want to do that.
Right,
I'm
exactly.
terribly timid. I wouldn't go skiing or skydiving or anything like that. But a lot of people aren't. It is a safer culture now, but I think we're losing something. And I don't think you want to turn it into Disney.
Here is another sidebar about British traditions which have been carried on without as much cruelty but with some risk and danger, as we discussed. There's the cheese rolling at Cooper's Hill in Gloucestershire. Every spring bank holiday, crowds gather to watch daredevils hurl themselves down a terrifyingly steep hill in pursuit of a huge wheel of double Gloucester cheese. The cheese can apparently reach speeds of 70 miles per hour while the participants tumble, crash and often end up in hospital. Despite safety concerns and official bans, locals still fiercely keep the tradition alive. There's the Burryman's Parade in South Queensferry in Scotland. Every August, a local man is chosen to be completely covered in burrs, that's spiky seed pods that stick to everything. He's then paraded around the town for up to 9 hours, drinking whiskey through a straw as he goes, bringing luck to the town. It's exhausting, claustrophobic and painful, but deeply respected as an ancient ritual of good fortune. Then there's the tar barrels of Ottery St Mary in Devon. On Guy Fawkes night, that's 5th of November, flaming tar barrels are hoisted onto shoulders and run through the narrow streets. It's a bit like the Birkhead Clavey. The heat is intense, the barrels are unpredictable, sometimes exploding or spilling. Men and women take turns and the town rallies to keep the tradition alive. It's equal part terrifying and exhilarating, drawing thousands of spectators each year. In Lancashire, there's the Haxey Hood, held on the 12th day of Christmas, 6th of January. It's a sort of game, basically a huge village-wide scrum for a leather tube called the Hud. Hundreds of people push and shove it slowly towards one of 4 pubs. It's not a sport so much as organised chaos, with roots in a medieval story about a noblewoman's lost hood. Bruises, blood and mayhem, guaranteed. And, finally, as Liz mentioned it, the Shin Kicking Championships held in the Cotswolds. Held there since the 17th century. Competitors face off in brutal shin kicking contests. The sport involves stuffing straw down your trousers for padding, gripping your opponent's shoulders and trying to kick their shins until they fall. Bloodied legs are common, but it's still held annually near Chipping Camden. A bizarre blend of rustic toughness and eccentric fun.
I want to talk a little bit about these traditions as they sort of came into, the kind of counterculture as we know it, the recent decades. I mean, Glastonbury is interesting. We've already talked about it, and of course, it's for lots of people around the world. Glastonbury is associated with the festival, which doesn't actually take place in the town of Glastonbury, nearby, but the Glastonbury Free Festivals, one of the more important ones, along with Stonehenge and Windsor, back in the late 60s, early 70s, that got the whole, festival movement going, right? It's now a very big corporate commercial affair. They're still doing some good works. But as these customs came into the countercultural years, there's something else which was going on as well, which was always part of some of them, wasn't it? Which is protest. And that, customs have become a tool somewhat for protest at times, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. And I think the role of the fool is part of it. But also there is, I think the early festival movement, I think that part of that strand of sort of hippie culture is kind of a return to old England, to old Albion, sort of reclaiming what was ours. And that is a working class thing. Because a lot of these things are focal, as I said, focal rural customs. They're not the customs of the aristocracy. The aristocracy have had some control over them. The authorities now have some control over them. But people want to sort of break out from that. So there is definitely a sort of a dovetail between, the sort of people who go on protest marches and the sort of people who Morris dance very often. If you want to look for the sort of overarching transgression, it's something for ourselves. It's not licensed by the church. Times like the Dorset Oozer, going around wearing a devil mask in most communities 200 to 300 years ago would have been a big no-no, but it's still allowed. And it's that sort of something for ourselves. This is our culture. That, I think, dovetails with a lot of the counterculture movement, who don't just want to be stuck in front of the box with bread and circuses, being told what to do and what's acceptable. And I think, if you want to really stretch it, you could link it to the popularity of horror films as well. That's pretty transgressive. Watching, serial killers do their thing is actually a perfectly acceptable way to spend your evening. That's really quite odd. Traditional English mysteries, detective stories are called English cozies. There's not a lot that's cozy about an actual murder. Yet, if I stay at home with a nice detective novel and a cup of tea, reading about a gory murder in the English countryside 40 years ago, that's seen as a really respectable, nice, middle-class way to pass my evening.
Well, you can't get any more high culture probably than a Shakespeare play, can you? Which, even though at the time was actually appealing to low culture as well. But, you're seeing this kind of violence, right? But it's now part of high culture. And as you say, with horror films, we can sit at home in the comfort and safety of our sort of living room while watching kind of people being beheaded and gutted.
Yeah, and because of the nature of Elizabethan theatre, cross-dressing, pretending to be girls, pretending to be boys, boys pretending to be girls, etc. Shakespeare, I don't think it's Timon of Athens. It's one of them. I can't watch it again, though. It was filmed with Anthony Hopkins. It was so gory.
It's the one where the girl gets her hands cut off. Well, she's raped, isn't she? Raped, and then she's had her tongue cut out and her hands cut off, so she can't tell who did it.
Just horrendous. And everybody goes, "Oh, Shakespeare, how lovely."
Those festivals, which were, used ritual noise, didn't they, in communal parading and performing. We featured Battle of the Beanfields, its anniversary recently, and there was issues around then about claiming common land, claiming common rights back, protesting against authority. Coming from, you could call it working class, or you could call it the sort of the underclass, the lower class, or just in a way, the sort of folk class. That's the way I would sort of see it in some way.
Yeah.
People causing a riot, as the authorities would see it. In fact, the Riot Act was read, wasn't it? Because they're actually protesting against something which is very old rights and traditions, which were being, as they would see it, were being taken away.
And the fact that they were essentially bailed out and sort of semi-rescued by a member of the local aristocracy. This guy went really above and beyond the call of duty in because I think his morals were just outraged by the behaviour of the police. He did a lot for getting people off, either released from prosecution, or in the case of the police, actually, attention drawn to this horrendous occurrence.
He did. He testified on court, didn't he,
He did.
on behalf of them. A surprising witness, because you got the sort of upper class and the underclass, as it were, together. But I mean, where we are today, Liz. I mean, you sort of zoom forward. I mean, obviously, the festivals itself have become quite corporate. Most, and there's still a very living tradition of fairs and smaller festivals in these islands, as there are elsewhere in the world. Which is stick to those kind of alternative and countercultural roots. The big ones like Glastonbury have become, behemoths, where it's incredibly expensive to get a ticket, even if you can get one. But what other ways do we see sort of folk transgression these days? And what are the folk customs, more modern ones, do you like?
Yeah, I mentioned shrines, little shrines that pop up. This isn't very transgressive, actually, but I think in a culture where funeral customs are very heavily regulated, they're starting to be less regulated. But I mean, when I was a kid, there was no sort of form of alternative burial. Cremation itself, on the other hand, has a really interesting history when it comes to transgression, because that was started in Wales by a completely insane clergyman whose child died, and he had him cremated on the hillside, causing absolutely massive ructions. But now it's you have the funeral service, you're cremated, you have a burial, and you still don't have an enormous amount of leeway around how you celebrate or commemorate people's deaths.
Yeah.
And roadside shrines, where in a way the place where the person died is, for whatever reason, seen as almost more important than the actual grave. There's one here from some poor kid who got knocked down on his way to school, and that went on for years until after, I think, the family moved eventually, and it has now been discontinued. But some of them are quite big and quite elaborate.
We see bunches of flowers tied to lampposts. I mean, you talk about the ghost bike as well, which is a sort of really poignant thing, isn't it?
I think it's in the States, in a couple of European countries, where I think, especially if the cyclist's been killed, they have a white painted bike with flowers tied to it put on the spot where the person died. And that's always felt very atavistic to me. The recognition that the place where they died, their spirit might still be there in some form.
And also it has a functional use, because it actually acts as a kind of warning, doesn't it, as well? It's a sort of warning maybe to cyclists and to drivers, As we live in an online world now, largely, how do you see sort of digital folklore evolving, or do you?
Well, the conspiracy theory, the urban legend is, Pizzagate is a form of folk culture, although I have to say I think it's a particularly pernicious and negative form of culture. But the fact that people latch onto it so quickly is, to me, almost more interesting than the actual content. So you could basically have a conspiracy about pretty much anything, and somebody out there will believe it. That meme of birds not being real, I don't know if you've come across that.
That's a new one.
Somebody started them, and it was a joke.
Okay.
The birds are not real, that they're little, projections or robotic devices or something. And obviously this was just a tongue-in-cheek piss take. But that turned into something that quite a lot of people actually took seriously. Australia's not real. That's another one. People are very conspiracy-minded. I think that's probably always been the case. But their options were very limited. If you live in a village and, you don't go anywhere, or you go to the market town once a year to the fair, your options for what you believe are limited essentially to the supernatural and the Christian church, and probably some views about the nature of the aristocracy. But some of this wackier stuff is just not really going to come your way. And now it's at your doorstep.
Right.
So, you can find anything out there.
And after all, some conspiracy theories do turn out to be true.
Yes, and there are conspiracies.
There are conspiracies out there, it's true. A lot of the conspiracy theories, some of which may turn out to be true, are operating as a kind of trickster method. They're actually reviling or undermining authority figures, aren't they? I mean, they may turn out to be completely unfounded, but there is that thing going on, isn't there? You've got these establishment figures who are being accused of all sorts of stuff. I think President Macron of France's wife is being accused of being a man at the moment, for instance.
It's really interesting because quite often the conspiracy doesn't focus on what is obviously an actual conspiracy politics. Trump has come to save us from the elites of the Illuminati who are promoting the abduction of children. President Trump's associations with Jeffrey Epstein are obviously some kind of at least emergent conspiracy, even if it's not an actual conspiracy. There is a lot of dodgy stuff there, but conspiracy theorists of a particular flavour don't tend to focus on that. They tend to kind of dart off to the side into, Macron's married to a man or something, or Michelle Obama's actually a man. And it's like, I'm too clever to focus on what's actually in plain sight. So I'm going to come up with this completely wacky theory to show how original I am. That's quite a cruel comment, and maybe a bit harsh, but I think there's some element of truth in it, definitely.
Yeah, and also it targets the usual suspects, women, doesn't it, in this case? And not the ones that should be targeted. And in terms of the diversion or the wrong targets, that's why I think for me, we were talking about earlier in terms of risk, we're obsessed with minimizing risk, but in fact, some of the very big risks, the environmental risks, for instance, are not being attended to. They're much more threatening than whether somebody's going to get their fingers burnt at a ritual.
Yeah.
Were there any traditions that you encountered which you just thought, these are too unsettling or too weird to include?
The transgressions that come up in folk customs are actually fairly sort of explicable and straightforward. I didn't really include anything like Satanism, because a lot of this stuff is just a moral panic. It's not actually what people do. And in pagan terms, I've never come across anybody doing, for example, actual ritual sacrifice. There are people who do some nasty stuff and say that they're pagan, or are sort of passing it off as pagan, of the kind of, sexual pressure. I'm a high priest, sleep with me and I'll make you a high priestess, that kind of stuff. That's just ordinary sexual assault, really, with a robe on, not baked into paganism. So there wasn't anything I came across that I just thought, ooh, we can't do that. Not in this culture.
Were there any traditions or customs that have gone that you'd like to bring back, at least see revived in some way?
Most of them are still actually going, even really weird ones like hunting the Earl of Roan, which I think we took out of the book, which is when people sort of reenact this historical event. Yeah, historical reenactment is a whole other ballgame, really, because it's not exactly a folk custom. It's more like a sort of a hobby. But I do know people who are really seriously into, the Battle of Tewkesbury, so reenacting that, and dressing up as a medieval knight or whatever, as a roundhead or something, and whacking hell out of somebody else. That's got a distinctly transgressive element to it. It's sort of below the radar, really. People just say, "Oh, Battle of Tewkesbury, what a wonderful event."
What about magic and folk customs? We live in a time when the belief in magic and the supernatural hasn't disappeared. It might even be as strong as ever, right?
Yes.
Certain things have changed a bit. I mean, we've talked about, the beliefs here at Findhorn, moving from extraterrestrials to fairies to devas to angels. But what's that overlap between our sort of sense of belief or wish to believe or skepticism about magic and these customs?
A lot of folk customs come out of, the political, like Bonfire Night. They come out of Christian church, like mystery plays. They come out of local sport, like shin kicking, like street football. They don't actually come out of ritual. That's probably more recent. Things like Beltane celebrations or Halloween. Halloween obviously is older. Mischief Night, where the dead are supposed to, come back and haunt us to some extent. You see ghosts, you see supernatural entities. I think Beltane and Samhain, or May Day and Halloween, are the two biggies in which that actually occurs in terms of folk ritual. Many years ago on May Day, you would not have had a Beltane ritual. In, say, the 1700s or the 1800s, it would have been a Christian thing. You'd have danced around a maypole, garlanded things with flowers. It's kind of secular. It's Halloween, I suppose, really is the big one that's, retained that supernatural element.
On the subject of the supernatural and folk traditions and, what happened to energies from the past, I had this rather strange esoteric thought, which I'm going to bounce past you, Liz, as I thought you'd probably be quite receptive to it, which was reading like Evans Wentz's survey of the fairy faith in Celtic countries, or Robert Cook's The Secret Commonwealth. These are like people who dug into folk beliefs about the existence of other creatures around us. And it's quite evident from those books that a lot of the people in these islands just took that belief as absolute matter of fact that there were these other creatures, the fairy, you might call them. So I was wondering, well, what if there was? What happened to that consciousness? How did it disappear? And I had this kind of bonkers idea that, fairies, of course, are amoral. They're very attractive. They're often very charming and slightly strange. So I was wondering whether fairy consciousness is still with us, but it went into what we call psychopathy. Psychopaths are often described as amoral, charming, can be very attractive and rather strange. So I thought I'd throw that past you. What do you think about that?
I haven't got that far, but I do think there's a definite line of descent from Dracula, Moriarty, Hannibal Lecter, the modern serial killer. I think there's like the very clever, powerful dark outsider. I think there's a direct kind of connection between those archetypes.
Given your work, given your writings, and given where you live, do you have a sense of the other, the magical, and still fading or secretly hidden behind our kind of modern lives?
Yeah, I definitely do. I see, the apprehension of coincidences everywhere, and that can tip over into madness, actually. I think magical thinking and mental health are a really interesting conjunction, which is a really, really big question, which is probably too big to go into now. Do I believe in magic? Yeah, I kind of do, actually. And I certainly believe in, a sense of wonder about the world and about nature. I think that's what paganism has given me, perhaps, is that sense of the wonder of the beauty of the world, really, in terms of what's growing, the natural world, what the birds are doing, what the sun's doing, the stars. Magic is looking up into the sky and seeing that incredible starscape, assuming it's, not cloudy.
Liz, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much to Liz. Well, of course, public shaming rituals haven't completely gone away. Until recently, they had the dunce parades and public shaming in Chinese schools. Academic underperformers accused of bad behaviour made to wear placards. And there's the perp walks in the US and elsewhere. Police stage managing public presentation of arrested subjects, walking them handcuffed before the media. Village shaming rituals in India, sadly. In some rural areas, people accused of theft, infidelity or dishonour, probably women mainly, sadly get paraded through the village, sometimes with faces blackened or shoes hung around their necks. And of course, we've got doxing and cancel culture online. People accused of offensive behaviour or speech from either side, exposed, ridiculed, ostracised at scale. It sort of echoes. There's this rough music or pillory traditions, but the village is now the internet, and the mob can number millions. So maybe we haven't changed that much. I'm quite glad that those kind of traditions have died out around here, but I'm glad also that some of the darker, slightly more risky and dangerous ones have survived down into our era of health and safety, safeguarding and fear of litigation. That's not a critique of people who try and keep us safe, by the way, but I think many of us feel that not only is a risk-free world impossible to achieve, but also it might not be desirable to achieve, and that by attempting to free our lives and our traditions from any darkness, from any disruption, we do run the risk of losing the transformatory, transfiguratory potential that they have, and their ability to live out our darkest fears, desires and impulses in a controlled way. We have an interview coming up with Joshua Schrey, the mythologist, about the trickster, this archetypal fool, the archetypal disruptor. He's not on your side, he's not on my side, he's not on the side of the traditional counterculture or the progressives. He doesn't take sides. Trickster jumps from side to side. Josh thinks that if we don't make a place for the trickster, we don't feed the trickster in some ritualized way, we run the risk of him, it, her, turning into the dark clown. A very negative, disruptive force indeed, which we might even see around us these days in the wide world. Thanks for listening.
thanks to my recent correspondence, writing with some terrific suggestions. Chris, John, Annette, Angie, and Pete. Much appreciated. Always great to hear from people. You can be in touch too with suggestions and check out everything else that we do, including upcoming events. We've got our London Month of the Dead Festival. If you listen to this in summer 25, and in December we're showing that classic folk horror film, The Wicker Man, with a kind of live participatory score. More on that soon. In the meantime, I shall see you, hear you, meet you further down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides for more of these tales from the underground, from the other side, from the counterculture.